So I could say for all travel check-ins through the Foursquare API, unlock this scene of the story. And we selected a couple scenes up front that had to be linear, and then several scenes in the middle that could be non-linear. You could watch them in any order. And then the last few were linear again. And so the way that this thing worked was that wherever you lived in the whole world, if you had access, if Foursquare had data about that location, and somebody sent a check-in, it would unlock that scene, and you could watch that part of the movie. And so that's, again, just what does information know about itself? What is the data that I have? And then when can I send that? What's the right timing to send the next cue? Okay. Yeah. I think that's it for my diagrams. Does anyone have any questions about any of this stuff, or even unrelated questions? I'm happy to answer any. Or give recommendations about stuff. Anyone need any recommendations about resources or?
I'm curious when you actually go and delve into user testing, where do you get your users?
Good question. And Kirby was asking this. So today I was just pricing out a remote usability testing tool. One of them was called Try My UI. One of them is called Validately. And Try My UI is $1,000 a month for the enterprise, or one of the enterprise ones, and that includes access to their testing platform, which does do like video recordings and time-stamped annotated notes, which are really nice. But it also includes unlimited testing credits to get, that includes the incentive that you have to pay this person, and access to their whole pool of users. And in that pool of users, I can ask them a couple demographic questions. Do you fit in these demographics? But I can also ask them screener questions that say things like, have you ever traveled for ecotourism? And then they have to answer that and say why or how they meet that criteria, and then I get to test with them. But one of my rules for testing and getting users is the lower fidelity the concept, the broader your test base, your users can be. Let me say that like this. So this is my actual user, and this is just like, Joe Schmo. And this is low fidelity. Oh my God. And this is high fidelity. And so if you've got just like cut up pieces like paper and pencil or something like that, and it's just like super low fidelity, just real rough, you could test with like, people who aren't in your real demo that you're trying to go for. But if you're testing something that's about learning music through a game, you're gonna need to, at some point, test with people who are learning to play instruments. Yeah. So fidelity of the prototype is tied to it. There's remote usability testing tools. And then just think of like the places that somebody might go. Like, Kirby, we were just talking about this. And, with this music thing, I'm like, go to Guitar Center. Like, try to find somebody there. And if, after 3 times going, you just can't get anyone, then to move on to the next one. I mean, yeah, it's just try stuff and then see what works or doesn't. And then, yeah.
Makes sense. Any notes on Validate or Validately?
Validately. Yeah. Right, theirs is like $500 a month, but then $15 for each test participant. And I don't plan on testing more than 30 people per month on all the different projects that I'm working on, just because I can't even fathom doing more than that and all of the other work. So I'm going to go with the Validately platform. But I like Try My UI. It's okay, and there's free plans. I think Validately has a free plan too. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Other questions or ideas or things you want reactions to, resources, hopes, dreams?
Sure. Earlier when you talked about the learn, make, show cycle, you seemed slightly disappointed that maybe games don't start with learn. How would you start the cycle?
Only insofar that when I start to make a software tool that's not a game, the learning part of interviewing somebody to understand issues that they might be having, contexts that they're in, things that they like about the current way that they solve it. I don't know if you can do that for a game. I don't know if you can go to somebody and say, what are the pleasurable parts of Donkey Kong, and then build that in and make sure you have that. Although, I don't know, maybe you can. Like, I am so about not ever having an answer that I'm happy to change my mind on anything, and that's why that learn, make, show cycle I like it so much. But yeah, I don't know any game. Yeah, that's why I asked Louis, like, if there's any game developers in here that ask people what they want.
So I would actually argue that when you're starting off and you're showing people your game, that actually bleeds into learn as well.
Definitely. So that usability testing, that's a type of learning that really does make sense for this. But interviewing and doing a user interview like that, I don't know if that makes sense.
User interview.
Yeah.
Yeah, because from my like standpoint, a lot of times when you just made like a quick prototype of a game, some simple mechanics, and you show it to someone, it's usually what you want to see in the game.
Sure.
Not versus what other people, you don't know what other people want to see in the game and what they expect of it.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
I guess that's where it leads into more
Learning.
Show and learn.
Yeah, that's why show's broken out from the learn one, because it really is a totally different type of learning that goes on there when you show off a game or something like that. Yeah. And then there, yeah.
Just for music's sake, do you have a short list of UI blunders and like the worst examples?
I mean, I don't like carousels that don't mess with symmetry. So if you ever see like a carousel on a web page that is like, so this is my favorite kind of carousel, one that messes with symmetry somehow. But if you see one that's like, here, and you'll probably find one of these on the Nat Geo site. So just don't tell me about that. Don't at me. But sometimes it'll have little arrows, stuff like that. I think that messing with symmetry. There's so much stuff that you can do by making the content, which is these two squares, the UI, instead of adding in these extra arrows. Like when you mess with symmetry, you no longer need those arrows. I mean, if this was a touch interface, we wouldn't need the arrows. But maybe if you don't want to show the arrows until on hover, then you would know, at least that you can do that right there. Whenever there's any interface that says, if you go to lots of desktop web pages, and even in mobile too, it'll have, say this is the top of the web page, right? And it goes on below here. But this is just the view. This is the viewport. They'll have like intro message, and then it'll say like scroll or click. Like whenever there's something that you're like telling somebody how to interact with it, I'm like, oh, what did you do?
Well, it's kind of clickbait because it encourages you to keep reading, but you just keep scrolling.
Yeah.
The density of content is terrible.
Yeah. So there's that. I mean, one of my developers a long time ago, she's like, what were we making? It was something, and she called it a browser in a browser. And I think that like a carousel that I was just drawing, that is a browser. You are browsing through content horizontally in a vertically oriented browser. And so sometimes when people suggest carousels, I'm like, well, why don't you just put it all vertical inside the current vertical carousel that the page is already in? And so when people use carousels, it really needs to have a good reason, because it's also hiding things too, One of my pet peeves right now about our site, about the natgeo.com, I'm currently working on most of on the .org stuff, but on the .com side, they'll have a page and a nice big beautiful image and some caption, and then it says read more right here. And the idea that we are hiding content tied to the whole reason that you're here blows my mind. Like, why hide what they came for? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. And the reason that they do that is for like some sort of print layout block that they have in their head where everything needs to be always ending right like this and stuff like it. Yeah, it's shenanigans. Question?
So I was wondering if you could address some of the designing interview issues. Because, clearly, if you're interviewing for a successful version of Donkey Kong,
Yeah.
it's a little bit different than a successful version of like the art thing,
Yeah.
where I'm, hi, PTA mom, gonna be one of the great consumers along with my teachers.
Yeah.
And then we're gonna debate like the virtue of, do we let the kids access it on this thing, or are we just all gonna pull out our Chromebooks?
No, that like for the games, I don't know if user interviews make sense. For the software tools, software experiences where you're consuming content, that makes sense to me. Big time. Information seeking stuff, that makes sense to me. But I don't know how you interview somebody for fun or to understand what fun is. Like, yeah, Kirby?
I can add in here.
You got an idea?
I do. I have two things here. The first is that there's this idea of like psychographics, that different kinds of people like find different kinds of things fun. And also that like as a designer, you're not designing for yourself, you're designing for your user base. And so it's not necessarily true that you're gonna like to play the kind of thing that you're making this time. Mm-hmm. So like seeking out those people and seeing why they're really into this thing, I think can have a place in the process.
Yeah.
But in the real world, maybe you're working at a company that has already made a game like this before.
Yeah.
So they don't need to do that.
Yeah.
And then the second thing I was going to mention is specifically like here in DC, there's a lot of serious games initiatives. And
That's a great
they
point.
also like, is usually a game where the point of it isn't to make the game, it's to teach about this issue or raise awareness. And like a lot of times they'll do a research paper,
Yeah.
or like do some research and then be like, oh wow, how can we like let people know about this? And so you've already got like your for list there in a sense.
Yeah. Yeah. If a game is tied, if there's something that's about a game that's tied more towards like a social good thing or an education thing or something like that, then the interviews could start to yield some pretty fruitful information for you. There's typically no reason not to go talk to people and get and collect information, but there's definitely a point where you have to say, okay, I've learned enough, time to make something. And sometimes I feel like with game designers, they typically know what they want to make from the get-go, which is fine, and because you'll soon show somebody, don't make the whole dang thing, and then you get through your cycle. Okay, any other cues, questions, thoughts? Anyone think this is all bullshit? No?
Any other further reading?
Further reading materials on UX stuff? There's a good book called, most of the list apart stuff is really good. A list apart, it's called A Book Apart, but they've got one called, there's two. Designing for Emotion, Aaron Walter, I like that one a lot. And then Design for Real Life, where you get into these, what they call stress cases that have to do with things like, Native Americans not being able to use Facebook because Facebook's database is saying, your name is not real. And that's, crazy. Yeah, Facebook can't get anything right. That's what happens when you design for everyone, right? You're gonna miss out on all this stuff, all the stress cases. They would call it, it's not an edge case, it's a stress case because it could be very important, Like the idea of like, is your friend anniversary? And it's like somebody that you're like, when you see their face, you're like in a rage and you know. Okay, so I like those two books. There's a book by Abby Covert, who is an information architect, called How to Make Sense of Any Mess. That's pretty good. I just like the idea of plugging an information architecture book because, again, that goes into like data structures, data science, and what does information know about itself? James?
What are some of the UX UI principles for web design and mobile design that carry over well into VR, AR, and which ones don't?
Direct manipulation is one, and that's an Apple human interface guideline, and that has to do with, again, like don't put UI on something that you can interact with directly. So again, just going back to the carousel idea, if you have direct control over this thing, don't put buttons on there that are about tapping. Just let it sit there, and you know that somebody can directly interact with that. And I think that in VR and AR, you're going to have the exact same situations where you want to directly manipulate something as opposed to a abstracted layer of control, which would be like the little buttons right here, right? I don't know what head tracking could do to as an interaction tool. Yeah.
Future sweat.
Yeah, I don't know, and maybe like eye tracking is going to get a lot better. That it's a hard, or gaze tracking or whatever they call it, where you might be able to interact with like where you're looking at something. But I don't know a ton about that stuff. And I don't have any good resources for you on that. I don't know. Whenever I hear VR, AR stuff, I'm just like, I want to be working on things that people have more access to, and I just don't think that there's enough install base for that kind of stuff. And so it's just not my particular, area of interest. I'm way more interested in things that people have like access to. So like, HTML. Love that stuff. Okay, any other questions? You? Yes?
Yeah, I got
Well, you've got the good ones.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll move over into, Kirby's got some good game-specific questions that are going to hurt my head.
Okay, first up is what do you think makes a game have great UX? And also feel free to generalize this towards apps or websites or anything that pops in your head.
Yeah, well, you shared with me this great video that had to do with like mini maps in a game where, you'll have inside your game, here's your next waypoint that you have to go to. And that it's been in so many open world games recently that it feels like it is not allowing me to do the exploration that I want to. And so in a game like, what was it recently that, so I was playing The Witcher 3, and I went and it had the controls, and you could turn off all of the UI. And that made the game very difficult. But it was just more fun because I was like, I had to stop and look at like a sign on the path that I was on. I'm like, okay, I guess I'm going the right way still right now. And it could stretch the game out to be really long, but then I get my $60 worth. I like ones that break out of, okay, again, what does information know about itself? Going back to that principle, Kojima